Part two of finishing off a drawing using cross-hatching technique. So since the last video, you can tell I went through, and as I was doing in the first part when we were talking about using crosshatch line technique and carefully looking at what you see, I continued looking into the shapes and simply began to build value where I saw value. One of the big differences is I spent some time using a scumble technique and build up a dark background. Often a background can be really useful, that negative space, both to create the illusion of depth but also to give you a nice crisp silhouette, particularly since this is a light local value item that's here. So I basically spent another probably 30 or 40 minutes on this drawing since the last first part of the video. So at this point, what you would be doing, those last things, when I look at this, I can see, and as you move towards the end of a drawing, and remember at the beginning I said determine what your goal is, and this one was something that was going to have a full value range using cross-hatching that we were going to spend about 90 minutes on. So at this point I'm probably 75, maybe 80 minutes into this. So you're sort of at that last phase where you look at what you have and start to locate. Are there areas that need more attention? Are there areas that you find an error? So for example, up in here, I can see that I never clarified this edge. So I'm going to revive that scumbling and just slightly clarify using the background value where the edge of that curve for the top of the bottle, that top plane was. I'm going to enhance looking at the objects that are directly across, because again this is all based on what I'm seeing, and I see when I look over there that there's greater contrast in this metal bezel, what holds this brush. So I'm going to come in and just enhance some of those values, and it's reflected, so what I'm seeing is going to have fairly sharp contrast because it's reflected. So I'm just going to come in and slightly enhance some parts of that. I also see that there is a little bit more contrast in my cast shadows. So I'm going to come down into this cast shadow on this side of that mug, and I'm going to come over to the core shadow in the interior of the mug and just slightly enhance that gradation from very dark over towards light. And then similarly I'm going to do that on the base of the objects because it's the darkest where they are intersecting, touching the table, so the cast shadows are absolutely the strongest down there. So I'm pulling one line and then I'm going to just let it blend out so that the gradation goes from very dark. And as I'm doing this cast shadow, I realize that my notes that I made still has this line right here to where that cast shadow zone was going to be. Well, I don't need the line to hold a shadow, so I'm going to get rid of that. I already did that when I was looking earlier at the cast shadows in some of the other parts. There's also just a little corner of the table visible, and I think it needs a little bit of clarification, so I'm going to just enhance that darkness back on that one area. And then I'm going to just keep evaluating. Now one thing that is always helpful, as I was working I just took a scrap of paper, and if I'm working on a certain area I lay the paper over. It keeps from getting your hand completely covered with lead, but more importantly it keeps you from smudging what you have in place. So one of the things that I see when I'm looking is that I want to enhance some of the highlights, and when I want a very specific little highlight, what you can do is if I lay a sheet of paper next to a sheet of paper, and I isolate where I want a little sliver of brilliant highlight on that metallic brush bezel, and then I just erase through just to try to get that brilliant highlight that I wanted. Would have been very hard to do that just with an eraser. Same thing when I look down on the little highlights that are happening within the little edges or the curve of that bevel. I can come through and just slightly enhance. So in this case I haven't isolated it on all sides, but I made an edge. So that helps these shimmer a little bit more now. Looking, again, always looking at the still life, I see that up where the paint is smeared on that lid, it's not really very clear here yet, but when I look it's very distinct. When I look over at the actual cap. So I'm going to come in and just try to clarify the fact that this cap has ridges in it. It gets darker on this side, and it has some smeared paint on the top. So I want that to sort of read much more clearly like paint that is smeared up there. This would be another place where if I wanted, I could actually, so I'm going to just, I could do this with an X-Acto, I could do it by just tearing. So I'm sort of tearing a curve, and I'm going to look up here where I see this one edge of that, where the white paint is really clear, and once again I'm just masking it out using my paper, and I'm going to come in with the eraser and just clean up. I see where there's a little smear of it that comes down, and since this is an odd little detail, but one that I think would make this interesting, I'm going to spend the effort. So once again I'm arranging my little mask, and then I'm erasing through the gap I create so that I can start to suggest that there is some paint smeared. It's white paint up there on that black cap, that local value black. Now I've picked up a really dark pencil, it's a 7B, and I'm just going to come in and I'm going to sharpen a range, a contrast range, by just enhancing, and I decided to go to the right, side opposite the color source. Even though this is the distant background, I still want to have some variety back there, so I'm just going to slightly enhance the range that it seems to go from darker and then gradually get a little bit lighter as it gets to the other side of that negative space, the background. And that way now I have this side having less of the white showing through, less, the pattern is still there, but it isn't as high contrast as this side, so I'm conveying that there is some change in the light. And when I look, I see that I could enhance the value down here. So my background, the white table, still has the same value. So what I'm going to do, when I look, it is very light. So I can either decide to create some subjective value, or I'm going to grab a 2H. It's a really hard pencil. So that's the hardest one in my kit, which means it's going to make very, very, very pale value. And I'm just going to come through and I'm going to slightly enhance that shadow on this object. And I also realized I forgot that there is a cast shadow coming from this cap. So now I'm going to introduce that cast shadow. It's fairly pale, but it is there. So I'm just scumbling with a very light pencil, and I'm going to come and just enhance so that there is some value, some shadow on this side, and then I'm going to use my eraser and make sure that I have contrast between that light shadow, so this maybe 10% gray, and the white of the page. And then when I look down, I realize that I still have this highlight edge. You have a black ceramic painted edge, so that's local color, but you also have a highlight catching. So I sort of need some kind of a template, some way to find that curve. So this is where I would either cut an exact template out of my cardboard or see if I can find something. So I'm going to wander over and look for a circle template. Circle template sitting anywhere? Okay, lacking a circle template, I am going to try to cut. So what I'm going to do is I look at that curve, and I'm going to just see how close I can get by just freehanding. And I can locate, I got some of what I needed out of that. And I'm just going to lay this in. And let's see if I can just sharpen that highlight around that curve. So I'm using this roughly cut mask. I'm moving it around so that I can try to find that curve. So I'll just go in and refresh that shadow that got slightly erased out. And now I see that highlight a little bit more clearly again, showing up in there. And I'm just going to enhance where I erased into some other area. And as I look through, is there any other place? I see a sharp highlight coming down through this bottle. It's sharp on one side and not on the other, so I'm just going to lay that template piece of paper and I'm erasing through. And I see that there is a highlight on this back edge. So I'm going to do that same thing again. There's a little sparkle that happens in this back curve. So once again, I'm just going to figure out a way to get that little highlight without. It shows up again down here. There's a little sparkle in the water on that back edge. So I'm using the eraser as a drawing tool to help me clarify places where I see some highlight. And I'm going to come up, and when I look, this has actually bands where there's just slight shadows, because inside of this semi-transparent plastic I can see layers. So I'm just going to do that. It adds a little additional detail and interest. And at this point I would probably say I have a fairly resolved full value, sort of 90 minutes-ish direct observation sketch using all line derived crosshatch technique. So now if I was going to continue more into this, trying to move it more and more to a rendering, then I would continue to refine this gradation. I would continue to soften and refine what's happening in these reflections. So you could continue taking it more and more towards a rendering. But this is a pretty nice result when you're trying to capture from direct perception what a collection of objects looked for. And notice I never blended this. There's no blended value anywhere in this piece.